Thank you very much. Well, I must say it's very nice to be home. It's been a long time since I've been back in Durban for an event of this kind, a political event, talking about issues of political importance to the nation. And it's also long overdue that CASAC makes its presence felt in this important part of our country. So we're very pleased and privileged to be here today. Just to add to what Rama has said in terms of an apology on behalf of Sipho Kuchana, the chairman of CASAC, for unfortunately not being able to be with us here this evening. He unfortunately, due to other business commitments, was called away to an urgent meeting this afternoon. I'm going to talk on a very similar issue to that what Sipho was going to speak about. Perhaps he would have focused a little bit more on the issues of economic transformation than I will. But nevertheless, I'm going to talk about the role of our Constitution in the transformation of our society. And in particular, I'm going to focus a little bit on the National Development Plan and a considered response that CASAC prepared to that National Development Plan earlier this year. Rama said very briefly a little bit about CASAC, that it's an organization of progressive constitutionalists, people that have come together to create this organization because we see the Constitution as a tool for the transformation of South African society, regardless of political affiliation, that it is the birth certificate of a democratic South Africa and should be our guiding tool in seeking to redress the inequalities of the past, to undo the injustices of apartheid and create a South African society based on peace and prosperity that we strive for. So that we say that the Constitution is a vision for an equitable society in which human dignity, fairness and justice prevail, and that it is also a document that is predicated on the notion of restorative justice, because in the preamble to the Constitution we speak of acknowledging the injustices of the past, of healing our nation and so on. So there's a deliberate attempt in the Constitution to say that this document is designed to deal with that legacy of our unfortunate and oppressive past. The Constitution is again premised on the notion of the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law. And when we talk about the supremacy of the Constitution within the separation of powers, where we have the executive, the government on one hand, Parliament as the legislative body on the other, and the judiciary as the third branch of the state. The Constitution itself, that document, sits above all of those three. And so when we say that we have a separation of powers, and there is often some debaters, well, if these three arms of the state are equal, well, when it comes to the issue of the Constitution, they're not, because the judiciary is then the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. And when we say that we have a separation of powers with checks and balances, the very fundamental and important task is given to our judiciary to interpret our Constitution, and in particular the Bill of Rights. It's an issue that I will comment on again later on in the course of this brief presentation. So the Constitution also acknowledges the role of inequality and of poverty and the negative impact that it has had and continues to have on our society. And I think if we're looking at the issue from the point of view of the present, we can say that poverty and inequality erodes trust and threatens our very democratic foundations. It has the propensity to destroy our social cohesion, and it results in poor social outcomes across the board. This is a quote that I think is very, very pertinent to our situation in South Africa today. It's something that was said almost 150 years ago, and it's worth repeating. Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is in an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob and degrade them, neither person nor property is safe. When we all feel vulnerable, these are the consequences that are likely to come about. So we can therefore say that poverty, inequality and unemployment have become buzzwords in our political lexicon of late. We talk about these triple evils: poverty, inequality and unemployment. But they are a feature, as I've tried to demonstrate already, of our transformation agenda that have been codified within the Constitution itself. And perhaps now, 18 years on, and the fact that these challenges continue to haunt us, and some would argue that there's indeed been a deterioration in those social conditions, that it is now legitimate for us to stop and to ponder what we may have done differently and what we can do differently now in order to reverse that trend. We believe that part of that answer lies in a candid review of our journey since the dawn of our democracy. And I think this is something that government must be given credit for, because I think that is something that the National Planning Commission has endeavoured to do. And we see the fruits of that labour in the National Development Plan, to which I will refer again in a while. But in our assessment of the draft National Development Plan, we identified a number of factors or weaknesses that we felt were there. Firstly, that a weak and incompetent state whose capacity continues to deteriorate, that there have been an inappropriate set of policy choices that have been taken by successive governments since 1994. But also acknowledging that there is a role that has been played by external factors beyond our control, most recently by the global crisis in the economies of North America, Europe, as well as in the East in the latter part of the 2000s. And fourthly and finally, the crippling impact of corruption on our society. I don't think we can have any sort of discussion about this kind of impact in our society without addressing this very, very fundamental issue of corruption. And we have a society where governance is based on the will of the people. So we carry a heavy burden of accountability as well as of transparency in the way that we are governed as a people. And to the extent that poverty and unemployment are degrading and dehumanizing, they constitute an affront to the very Constitution itself and to the justiciable Bill of Rights that I referred to as well. Our Constitution is an affirmation not just of civil liberties, but also of socio-economic rights, because we took a very deliberate decision when drafting that Constitution to incorporate socio-economic rights as enforceable rights within our Constitution. And that's why many people say that our Constitution is unique, it's a model for the world, because we took that bold step acknowledging where we had come from and what needed to be done. And so the new democratic state carries a mandate to deliver on these promises and to conduct itself in a manner that not only upholds these values, but also ensures that the rest of society does likewise. And aware of our painful past and its possible negative bearing if left unattended, restorative justice and redress form the basic cornerstones of our constitutional architecture. Clearly, a state that intervenes and mediates the interests of the poor and the marginalized is what was envisaged in the Constitution. The idea of an interventionist developmental state is not just a political slogan of one particular grouping, but it is about creating an enabled agency in which all sectors of society work together to realize that vision that is articulated in our Constitution. But when the inequalities in society are so rampant and the gap between the rich and the poor is clearly widening, the Constitution's vision of a just and equitable society is one that has been and is being betrayed. And I think this newfound agitation with the triple challenge of poverty, unemployment and inequality is therefore a recognition of this failure to address those challenges. And in our report entitled Subject to Citizen, Let the People Govern, which we released in May this year. We argue that a lot of our failures have come about as a result of policy and governance failure, rather than a problem with the Constitution itself. The Constitution is often used as a scapegoat for our failure to deliver, whereas we would argue that the Constitution is in fact an enabling document. We have not utilized that document in the correct way. To give you as an example, in terms of the economic policy shifts that we have taken since 1994, and I'll just run through some of these. We had the Reconstruction and Development Program. We had GEAR. We had what was known in the late 90s as narrow black economic empowerment. We then modified that to become broad-based black economic empowerment. We had the accelerated shared growth initiative, ASGISA, the new growth path, the industrial policy action plan, the national development plan, and we get arbitrary and ad hoc policy interventions, such as we had during the height of the global recession a few years ago, and we've seen recently with the meetings that the President has been convening in the last couple of weeks to deal with the issue of so-called labour unrest. And the reason I say so-called, I will explain in a moment. And the reason I say so-called is I don't think we can have a discussion of this nature without pausing to reflect on what the lessons and what the tragedy or the massacre of Marikana says to us about our constitutional order and the fragility of our democratic foundations. I think very few would disagree with the notion that the Marikana tragedy and our response to it will mark a turning point in our post-apartheid history. How we respond to this tragedy is going to define us as a nation as we go forward. That there were serious violations of human rights that took place on that fateful afternoon of the 16th of August, as well as in the days leading up to that. Because let us also not forget that many lives were lost in the days leading up to that and in the subsequent days as well. And these were violations not just of civil and the most basic right of the right to life, with people's lives being taken, but they represent serious breaches of economic and social, as well as those civil and political rights. The right to assemble, the right to protest, etc. But we must also stop and make mention of the fact that the right to assembly, the right to protest, is protected within the Constitution, but what the Constitution protects is the right to peaceful assembly and unarmed assembly. And we must also bear that in mind, so that we're not seen to be using the Constitution in favour of one group or another, but to say that we created these rights in the way that we did in order to create the kind of society that we wanted to see develop in South Africa. We've also seen through the Marikana tragedy an increase in state repression and what are being called zones of illegality. I need not stress the point too much here, speaking as I am in Durban, to talk about the Cato Manor hit spots as an example of those zones of illegality. But we see it also taking place in the industrial unrest that we've had, where there is almost a sense of impunity by the police that they were able to go in full glare of television cameras and take the kind of action that they did using live ammunition against protesters, whether they were armed or not. I think the issue is whether that response was proportionate in the circumstances, and the following Commission of Inquiry is obviously going to be seized of determining that matter. I think the causes of that crisis that unfolded on that day in Marikana, I think it is something that we've been noting for some time now. Many commentators and analysts have been pointing to some of the failures in our system of governance. And we've seen over the last few years incidents of what have been termed social delivery protests or community protests. And this eruption could have happened anywhere. It happened on a smaller scale a year and a half ago when Andres Tatania was shot and killed in Vicksburg. That could have escalated into a broader and a much greater catastrophe than it did. So Marikana was an accident waiting to happen. What were some of those multifold causes? Firstly, structural weaknesses in the state institutions, as I said, particularly within the police, that have permitted a culture of impunity and so on. An acute failure of leadership in both the government as well as within the ANC to deal with the issue of, particularly in the context of the mining industry, to give clear and unambiguous leadership in terms of policy direction in terms of our mining industry, which, let us not forget, is still the foundation of our economic well-being as a nation.
Yeah.
That there were also deep rifts in and between trade unions. I think that's an issue that needs nothing further said about it. And that there are unacceptable levels of wage inequality, and the fact that the Gini coefficient has increased since 1994, so that the levels of disparity between the lowest earners and the highest earners has grown. And it is those kinds of issues that lead to a breakdown in social cohesion and distrust that I spoke about earlier, that can then result in the kind of action that we've seen taken by desperate people in desperate circumstances in Marikana. So those root causes of chronic poverty and long-term unemployment can manifest themselves in those ways. We can add to that the issues of the continuation of the migrant labour system, the socio-economic conditions of workers on the mines, and so on. There's a whole plethora of issues, all of which we can look back and point to the Constitution as providing us with a template to address, which we as a nation have failed to address, not just government. And I think it's important to stress that one is not just pointing the finger at government in this regard, in that many others have roles to play in this, not least business and labour, as I've alluded to, but also traditional authorities in those areas, and so on. So I think the Marikana tragedy, in a sense, sums up some of the constitutional challenges that we face at this point in time. To come back to the broader macro issue of our response to the National Development Plan, the draft National Development Plan. And I'm going to preface my remarks here by saying that we submitted this report, as I've said, subject to citizen, let the people govern, to the Planning Commission. And they did take on board some of the comments and recommendations that we made that were incorporated within their final report. So I think they must be commended for going through a thoroughgoing and transparent process of engagement with citizens of South Africa and with civil society in particular. But in our looking at that report, we sought to do so that we could provide an input to the Planning Commission to look at these issues from a constitutional lens and not just from a purely economic or social perspective, but what does the Constitution guide us towards. And in our document we recognize the strong foundation that had been laid to realize the vision of our Constitution. So although we haven't delivered on all of the things that we perhaps should have done, there is a strong foundation that is laid within the Constitution, and we have very, very sound institutions of governance through an independent media, Parliament, Chapter 9 bodies, independent media, and so on. All of these face their own challenges and have their own inherent weaknesses, but they are still provide a strong foundation for building the kind of society that we want to build. We were encouraged to conduct a candid assessment of our failure, as I said, to make greater strides and to propose additional approaches to the National Planning Commission. Our report wasn't intended to be a complete critique of the National Development Plan, and we simply focused on what we believe to be the key levers that could accelerate our transformation agenda and create a greater partnership between citizens and government on the other hand. and what are the issues that could be game changers to take us beyond the current paradigm. The people shall govern proclaims the Freedom Charter, and indeed our Constitution envisages the kind of participatory democracy that was spoken of in that Freedom Charter. And yet our governance paradigm is now anchored on a seemingly unsustainable model that encourages dependency on the state for delivery. So whilst on the one hand we pat ourselves on the back for the fact that we've been able to significantly expand the social net, the social welfare net, and important as that is, that cannot be an answer in itself to the problems that we face. People cannot be seen, continue to be seen, simply as subjects of state rule and as dependent on government largesse for their development and sustenance. Indeed, what we need to talk about, which is something that I know that has been discussed in these fora before, is about what does it mean to be an active citizen? What does active citizenry mean? Because we need to take responsibility for our own development as well. But government, unfortunately, needs to create that environment. We ourselves cannot create sufficient of that environment, but we need to be willing participants in that process. So there needs to be transparency and accountability in government. So we have, for example, the promotion of administrative justice and the promotion of access to information and legislation. Yet we see some of that terrain being backtracked on with the State Information Bill that's still currently before Parliament. And importantly, I think we need to have a debate, a national debate about the issue of electoral reform. I think, I'm not going to speak much about it now, but perhaps it's an issue we can come back to in questions later. But I think we need to look at how do we create an electoral system that enhances the accountability of our elected representatives, so that we rediscover the notion of all power to the people rather than what exists at the moment, which is where power is located entirely within the ambit of political parties. And this has certainly played its role in reducing the effectiveness of Parliament as an oversight institution over government. And we believe that with enhanced oversight, the capacity of the state can only be enhanced rather than being stillborn as it is at the moment. And we need to have a state that recognizes citizens as partners and not as opponents or enemies, but that we are people that want to work together with government in order to achieve those objectives set in the Constitution. The Planning Commission talks a lot about a developmental state, but it's also very candid about the dysfunctionality in some of the state institutions. And that openness from the Planning Commission, as I said earlier, is something to be welcomed. I think the document as a whole is a very welcome one in that because it paints a picture of South Africa, warts and all. It seeks to paint a very rosy picture of our future, and it should rightly do so, because that is a challenge to all of us to create that rosy future. But we feel that some of the shortcomings in the report was that it recommends incremental reforms in some cases, whereas we believe that drastic measures are actually needed in order to have game changers that are going to change the trajectory of our developmental path. We need to acknowledge that public service deployment is no longer about advancing demographic representativity, but it is more about a rewarding allegiance to factions within political parties that happen to hold power. And this results in a mediocrity in government and a culture of mediocrity that is taking root within the public sector in South Africa. And it's permeating into other spheres as well. So we see in the private sector such mediocrity also being impacted upon. That leads to a lack of accountability, secrecy, and the culture of the old bureaucracy in the ascendant, the bureaucracy of the apartheid paradigm, of where we see the drawing back of the Protection of State Information Bill, seeking to make more and more what should be public information secret. Fortunately, the proposed media tribunal now seems to be off the agenda, but that was another example of seeking to claw back some of the the space for openness and transparency that had existed. And as I referred to earlier, the issue of the move from the police from a police service to a police force once again, and with police brutality being a threat to the free expression within South Africa. At a legislative level, we see lip service being paid to issues of public participation, and we're seeing it currently with the traditional courts bill that is currently before Parliament, which went through a very weak public participation process until government and Parliament were forced to relook at that. So we therefore recommended that the posture and the structure of the state needed to be aligned with the Constitution and with the developmental objectives. And this would require major change both in the level and the mix of skills required within the public sector to deliver on those. And that there needed to be a paradigm shift from the notion of service delivery to and on behalf of people to creating a partnership with people and with communities so that communities and citizens are empowered to enhance economic growth and development in their areas. And very, very importantly, to strengthen the oversight role of Parliament through issues such as electoral reform and also the strengthening of the so-called Chapter 9 institutions, the institutions supporting constitutional democracy, the offices of the Auditor General, the Public Protector, the Human Rights Commission, and so on. Some of you may be aware that there was a review of these entities that was undertaken in 2007 by Parliament, and it was chaired by Professor Carter Osman, and that report unfortunately has not been debated by Parliament as yet. It's a significant document that seeks to suggest how we can consolidate some of those Chapter 9 institutions, how we can enhance their efficiency and effectiveness. But it's an issue, again, that we need to come back to if we're serious about strengthening the role of our Constitution. In terms of property rights, again, the point I want to make here is that it's often been said that the Constitution is a constraint to land redistribution and land reform. That Section 25 of the Constitution that speaks to private property prevents government from achieving its transformation objectives in the sphere of land ownership and redistribution. And the common untruth that is too often repeated is that the Constitution has mandated that we have a willing buyer, willing seller arrangement. Nowhere in Section 25 of the Constitution that doesn't say that. That notion of willing buyer, willing seller is something that is government policy, that government can change without changing the Constitution. And indeed, I think in a speech last night, President Zuma started to acknowledge this by starting to look at how land reform could be speeded up by creating other mechanisms to deal with the transfer of ownership of land. So the Constitution has never been a constraint to the issue of land reform. All that it requires is that there must be just and equitable compensation, which is balanced between the public interest on the one hand and the private interest on the other, so that the compensation that must be fair and reasonable in the circumstances, which is all that the Constitution requires. So within those broad parameters, government is at liberty to create a policy framework in order to fast-track land reform. So in the initial draft of the development plan, we didn't adequately address that issue of economic redistribution as a whole, where we have seen now some changes being looked at. And I think, again, the Marikana issue has highlighted those contradictions within our society and has created the impetus for seeking to find new ways of addressing some of those issues. So our point would therefore be that it was government policy and the weak regulatory and enforcement capacity of the state, rather than the Constitution itself, that accounted for the failure to deal with the rampant inequalities in our society. A similar argument can be made in terms of human settlements. And we would agree with the Planning Commission in acknowledging the great strides that have been made in the delivery of housing since 1994. But I think we must also acknowledge that there's been a rapid urbanization in that period as well that has led to the substantial growth of informal settlements, in particular around major urban areas. And the National Development Plan failed to acknowledge that the free housing policy, the so-called RDP housing, was financially unsustainable in the long term and didn't come up with any alternatives. And we need to see a paradigm shift from the notion of black townships seen as dormitories for black labour to sleep and procreate, rather than as socio-economic hubs and communities. And again, the Marikana issue places this thing starkly in our midst. We didn't see creation of communities and of proper housing for those mine workers, a continuation largely of the hostile system, or migrant labour being taking up residence in informal settlements around the mines. So in our assessment, we felt that the housing market needs to be looked at in three different segments. The bank finance segment, which is those people who earn more than £9,500 a month, who are able to get a loan from the bank. The government finance segment, the so-called RDP housing, for those who earn less than £3,500 a month. But government has so far ignored that missing middle, in which a vast number of our people exist, earning between £3,500 and £9,500. So they're not eligible for free housing from the state, nor can they go to a bank and raise finance. And that needs a new approach from government to address that critical issue of far too many people who should be able to afford housing not being provided with the means to do so. Also on the issue of creating conditions for employable labour and looking at the issue of employability rather than simply at the issue of job creation. So the NDP focuses on job creation, skills development, and we've seen significant focus from government over the last few years, looking in particular at major infrastructure development programs as being the answer to the creation of jobs. But we need to go beyond that. We need to create conditions for competent labour to exist and to increase the employability of our labour force. So we need skills advancement, we need a vast improvement to our education system. It's another issue that I'm not going to focus on, but obviously it underpins a lot of what is being said here. We need to motivate the labour force to a higher level of productivity and a more positive attitude to work. And one of the things that a number of studies have focused on is that our approach to immigration and to foreign labour, particularly skilled foreign labour, to plug the gaps in our skills gaps that exist, that can enhance both the growth of our economy as well as the competitiveness. And we find a situation where even low-level jobs within South Africa are dominated by foreigners. And we need to understand better why this is. So we see it in the hospitality industry, security, tourism, and even in rural and township sponsor shops. In the most rural areas, you'll find immigrants from Somalia or Bangladesh running sponsor shops rather than local entrepreneurs. So we need to start to bridge the gap between the education qualifications and occupational competence. So not just looking at paper qualifications, but actually looking at the skills base of people. And we need to acknowledge that we operate in a globally competitive economy, and that our labour must be globally competitive. And I've touched on the issue of looking, not just focusing on large-scale industrialization projects and infrastructure development, but also focusing on the SME sector as well as the informal sector. Because in many respects, it's by creating greater opportunities for that informal sector that we're going to make the most significant impact on the issue of employment and employability. The final issue that I raised earlier has been a critical stumbling block to us in realizing the vision of the Constitution is that of corruption.
Yeah.
And Again, I think the Planning Commission have done themselves and us a disservice because they have fallen short in their recommendations on corruption. In short, their recommendations, we believe, are inconsistent with our obligations in terms of international law. It's interesting that in the diagnostic report which they published in July last year, the Planning Commission actually agreed with CASAC's position that we should have an independent anti-corruption agency established in South Africa. In the final report, they've changed that recommendation and have now suggested that we must strengthen the multi-agency approach that is currently in existence. And we have seen, despite everything the rhetoric that we hear from government, we've seen the ineffectiveness of those agencies and the fact that they are open to political capture and can be used to fight partisan political battles within political parties. We've seen it here recently with the so-called Amigos case in KwaZulu-Natal. I need not tell you the harm that corruption causes to not just to our democratic order, but to our economic prospects as well. CASAC has done a couple of major studies on this issue. Two reports that were published last year, one entitled Towards a Comprehensive Societal Response, which looked at both the constitutional, legislative, as well as the institutional framework that exists within South Africa to tackle the scourge of corruption. And we recommended the establishment of an independent anti-corruption agency that is directly accountable to Parliament and not to the executive, that would be seen to be much more independent, to be given adequate resources to do their work. And what we have seen is that new entrants in the public service have been socialized into a culture of corruption, secrecy, and a lack of accountability, that culture of the old bureaucracy that I referred to earlier. And I want to quote from President Mandela's last opening of Parliament speech in February 1999. And I think his words are as relevant today as they were then. And he said, I quote, "Our hope for the future depends also on our resolution as a nation in dealing with the scourge of corruption. Success will require an acceptance that, in many respects, we are a sick society. It is perfectly correct to assert that all of this was spawned by apartheid. No amount of self-induced amnesia will change this reality of history. But it is also a reality of the present that among the new cadres in various levels of government, you will find individuals who are as corrupt as, if not more than, those they found in government. This problem manifests itself in all areas of life. More often than not, it is business people who launder funds to curry favour with public servants. It is ordinary citizens who seek to buy themselves out of trouble. It is strange religious leaders who sing praises to criminals or hoard land acquired by the foul means of apartheid. All of us must work together for our redemption." I think if those words were spoken today, they would be just as Our recommendations in terms of corruption, as I said, would be to establish a dedicated, independent anti-corruption agency. And just as an aside, I can mention that in the Constitutional Court last year, which ruled that the Hawks, as it is commonly known, did not satisfy our international obligations nor our constitutional obligations to provide a sufficiently independent agency to deal with corruption. We believe that the SAP's amendment bill that is sought to restructure the Hawks still doesn't pass the constitutional muster and is likely to be challenged again in the Constitutional Court. We also need not just to focus on the issue of investigation and prosecution of corruption, but also on a vigorous public education program with regards to corruption. And this is something that a range of civil society organizations have taken on, Corruption Watch being one of those that we must applaud for taking on that role. And we believe that we need a three-pronged approach to dealing with corruption, that we must investigate and prosecute corruption, we must prevent corruption through taking proactive measures, and also, as I said, to conduct a widespread public education about the nature of corruption, what ordinary citizens can do to prevent it and to stop it from happening. The fight against corruption can only be enhanced by greater transparency and access to information, and by the participation of all sectors of society, citizens, media, civil society, and so on. And it is important also to make note of the fact that we speak of corruption, we're not just looking at government. Corruption occurs in all sectors of our society, including within NGOs and civil society as well. So we must look at ourselves and make sure that we are as clean as we want government to be. We need to cooperate with other states, because many of our transnational corruption involves transnational crimes in many cases, and leads to issues of arms smuggling, human trafficking, drug smuggling, and so on. So cooperation with other states, particularly neighbouring states, is particularly important. We need to strengthen our whistleblowing legislation. Just to give you one example of why that is important, in terms of the current Protected Disclosures Act, you can only blow the whistle on your employer as an employee. If you are aware, for example, that a client of your employee has engaged in corrupt practices, and you blow the whistle, you will not be protected under the Act. So the Act is very, very limited in its applicability, and it needs to be greatly enhanced in terms of its breadth, but also in terms of the protection that it provides to whistleblowers. Again, I need not remind people in this room of the fact of the increasing number of people whose lives are at risk as a result of blowing the whistle on corruption, and the numbers of people who have already died as a result of doing so. The other issue that is linked to that of corruption is the issue of party political funding. And again, it's something that we've seen parties coming together, and unfortunately on this issue we see all the parties coming together and not wanting to let us have access to who their donors are. And then unfortunately, without proper access to see who the donors of political parties are, and that there must be regulations in place to guide and regulate how parties are funded, including by increasing public funding of political parties, because our democracy relies on political parties. We need political parties in order for our democracy to flourish and to thrive. So we must be prepared to make funds available from the national fiscus for that purpose. But that can only be done if parties are also going to come clean in terms of their private funding. And finally, we need political will to deal with the issue of corruption. And that political will can be manifested in a number of ways. And simply saying that we're against corruption and we take action against corruption is not sufficient. Government needs to create an independent body. It needs to resource it adequately with both personnel and financial resources, and act without fear, favour or prejudice against corruption wherever it creates itself, and regardless of the political or social standing of the people involved. In conclusion, I hope I have not painted too negative a picture of where we are, although, as I said, I think the Americana tragedy does say to us that we are at a crossroads. But we must also acknowledge that we have made significant strides since 1994 in building a constitutional democracy in South Africa. And I think South Africans can applaud themselves for the role that we have all played in making those strides. But we now need to consolidate and entrench those achievements and to build upon them as well. We need renewed energy and innovative ideas. Some of those that I've tried to articulate that we have sought to make to the National Planning Commission, but many others that have come from other sectors of society as well. That speak to the issue of how we tackle the inequalities in our society and how we create an economically more prosperous society that will ultimately lead to a more peaceful and prosperous nation. And civil society, we have a critical role to play in influencing the development of our society. We need to find ways to continuously engage with each other as well as with government in order to try and find some of the answers to these challenges. But I think my core message today is that we need to put the Constitution and the issues that are encompassed in the Constitution at the very center of our developmental strategy, because those magnificent leaders of ours that created that Constitution for us had the foresight to create a document that would be long-lasting. It wasn't just a document that would see us through the transition from a budget, but provided us with a vision for the long-term development of the country. And we certainly hope that the National Planning Commission can be used as a mechanism within government to create some of the building blocks to build on that vision. Thank you.